everyone, welcome to another adventure with Beyond the Market. Today we're heading to Inzana Ranch Produce to learn all about apricots. We're going to get an inside look at how that crop is planted, grown, and harvested, and hopefully learn some fun facts along the way. We're so excited that you're here to join us. Let's get going!
My wife Joy is over there, so this is Tony and Joye, and it's Inzana Ranch Produce, and it's in Hughson, California. Actually, about 4 or 5 miles outside of Hughson. I was established pretty much at the same time we bought the property, August of '85, and we moved here in '86. This ranch started out in the 1880s, and in Stanislaus County, believe it or not, produced more wheat than any county in the country, and all of this land pretty much was dry farmed. At first we didn't know what we were doing. I had a pretty good feel for orchards and what would be required.
Tony and Joy have lived and worked on their nearly 200-acre orchard property for almost 40 years now. Although they began farming with very little experience, decades of hard work and dedication have definitely set them apart from the pack. They grow a wide variety of unique fruits and nuts, and unlike many other orchards, they do it all organically.
The organic changeover that took place in the early 2000s was basically because the more we planted around the house and where we lived and spent most of our time, the less we wanted sprays and chemicals and that sort of thing. It's what everybody else did, so you naturally thought it was the right thing to do, but not necessarily the best thing to do. By transitioning to living in the middle of where we farmed and worked, we didn't want the influences to involve chemicals, and we just started getting away from them.
In an ideal world, organic farming means that the farmers do their best to foster the cycling of resources, promote ecological balance, and conserve biodiversity. Technically, organic is a legal term that restricts certain practices on the farm, like spraying synthetic pesticides or using genetically modified crops. You may be surprised to learn that many organic farms simply use approved organic-based chemicals instead.
There's a little bit of a contradiction to organic farming. You think, well, there's not the spraying done, but in essence, the spraying is a means to an end. It's just a process. So spraying is an exercise in which you put something on a tree that protects it, but there's a lot of organic substances and a lot of organic sprays that are used on certain varieties of things, planting canopied trees and everything. Well, that only took about 20 years to develop, but in that time frame, everything else is kind of insidious. It happens, and you're so busy you don't even get to pay attention to it sometimes. California orchards, because of the heat in the Central Valley, particularly nut orchards, have really bad mite problems, which defoliate the trees because the mites feed on the leaves, and as a result, they stress the trees, and the trees will defoliate. And people spray for mites, but they don't realize if they just waited for good mites to eat the bad mites, and you set up a climate that invites the good mites to come in and eat the bad mites, then you don't have to worry about spraying. It's something that, like, all my neighbors will spray for mites, but I haven't sprayed for mites in 20 years and we don't have any.
Apricots are a type of stone fruit, or a fruit with a large pit in the middle. Apricots originate from Central Asia, but flourished in the Mediterranean climate of areas like North Africa and the Middle East. California also has a Mediterranean climate, which means we experience cool, rainy winters and warm, dry summers. Because of these ideal conditions, apricots thrive in orchards all across California. Let's walk through the orchard with Tony and learn about apricot varieties here at Inzana Ranch.
So apricots, that's what we're working for, is apricots. The fruit orchards make up about 10 acres, and there's about 120 acres or so of almonds and 50 acres of walnuts, then a whole bunch of mix here and there. Citrus is a couple acres. So the row that we just passed, the ones that are the highest are apricots, and they have not been pruned as recently as the rest of the orchard. And the top show that by the stems that are longer. So if apricots are pruned after they're harvested during the summer or early fall, or even earlier than that after they're harvested, it makes a tree much more healthy and less susceptible to cankers, which develop with sappiness around the cuts and then lead to infiltration of disease where the cuts are made at the time of pruning. So if we prune those early, which we did, they're gonna be growing sooner, and they are obvious in the orchard. So that row there with the higher stems are all apricots, and these would be apricots here.
Apricots have been cultivated for thousands of years. Today, there are many different varieties that have different colors, flavors, and most importantly, harvest times. Apricot varieties have very short seasons, with just a few weeks for farmers to harvest an entire crop. In order to expand the season, farmers and seed companies developed new varieties of apricot that bloom earlier or later than usual. Inzana Ranch grows a number of different varieties in order to keep fresh apricots at the market all summer, although Tony says that some apricots are just better than others.
The first trees are poppies in both rows because they're the earlier apricot that we have. It's easier to tell when they're ready to pick by having them closer to the beginning of the rows. Those are Castlebright, and we're picking Castlebright right now. The ones behind those are Royal Blenheims, and they're all green right now. These are old trees, they're about 30 years old. They were planted in fours, basically. I had 4 poppies at the front, 4 Castlebright, and then 4 Blenheims. And these are Blenheims, and you can tell they don't look like they're gonna be anything, but in about 6 weeks, they'll be ready to be picked. But the Castlebright is an old variety, a really good variety. It has nice color, benefits from the sun exposed, the tops of the trees and the sides that get a lot of sun make a nice red color. And you don't notice that from below. So you have to see it. Well, here's one here. So this would be the exposed portion of the apricot to the sun. This would be the exposed portion that we're looking at from below. Older varieties of apricots were planted for taste and not so much by convenience. And most of the newer varieties are designed around convenience. So when I was talking about them filling in the seasons with the late season and early season, that's basically to expand the market and to enjoy the apricots a longer period of time, but they're not necessarily the best apricots. And I actually have several varieties that are late season, and we'll pick apricots into the last part of August. And it'll be consecutive, and that's what my objective was to have apricots from basically early in the year all the way through the summer. And we usually have them. Okay, these are robatas. You recognize those from the other side? So you can tell by the progress of the fruit and also the coloring sometimes or the shape of a leaf. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There is a Brittany Gold. Brittany Gold is probably late August. Autumn Glow. I have a couple trees that I planted to see how they would go. They're actually September apricots. And they're actually almost green, but they have a great flavor. So consider the flavor first, obviously, when you're choosing, but don't be put off by coloring, because later season fruit doesn't always color, doesn't always have the benefit of the full sun that a summer fruit will have, and it's deceiving. It can be really good. It's just the way it works out. So basically, we've gone from poppy and some of the earlier new varieties to the mid varieties of apricots, all the way to the autumn glow, which was planted to be at the end of the rows, at the apricot row on the other side. And then you get a selection in here that's almost all recently developed varieties of apricots. And when I say recent, it takes a while for the trials and everything, maybe 10 years. And they're still developing, you know, these. That pretty much takes us through all of our apricots. It's really deceiving because it doesn't look like there's very many trees, but they span 3 months. It gives you a nice complement to a farmer's market presentation to have the apricot be represented over that period of time at your stand or at the market itself. There's probably not that many people that are going to have an opportunity to have apricots available for that period of time for customers to taste them, to be able to experience them, to then buy them in their markets or ask their produce managers to order them or stock them or whatever.
Wow, so many stone fruits we can barely keep up. Still, Tony says that there is a simple trick to know when an apricot is perfectly ripe, and he shares some of his tips for how to harvest.
And one thing that happens with apricots is the attention you need to spend to picking them. What you want to do is just a little bit of a feel from side to side between your finger and your thumb. And that's going to tell you a little bit about the softness. But at the same time, it's going to tell you whether or not it's getting close to being pickable. You don't want it to be too ripe, because what happens with older varieties is the stem does not separate. And when the stem doesn't separate, you pull out parts of the middle of the apricot, and it will go bad if it's not eaten within a day or two. The moisture, you're allowing the moisture to come in. It's the same with most fruit. The stem, any fruit grows from top to bottom, so the riper portion of the fruit is always at the bottom, and the least ripe is at the top. So if you're checking to see if it's ripe, you want to make sure the shoulders of the fruit are the way you want it to be eaten. And if it's too ripe at the top and you pull the stem out, that just introduces moisture, which is an accelerator to ripening. And the ripening acceleration then leads to what becomes rot. It's just an accelerated ripening or maturing process. It's not like the word rot has any bad connotation. It's just the ripening process. It makes it a little harder to pick apricots that are older varieties, because the later varieties, they biologically grew them to have the stems not come out of the apricot when you're picking them when they're ripe, and that allows you to pick them faster, and that allows them to ripen in the bins or in the packaging and not so much in the field, because they are able to pack them when they're not quite ripe in order to have them available to, consumers. Okay, so what you need to do is almost give it a half a turn or so, or to loosen it on the stem so it comes off without pulling it out. And it's time consuming sometimes if you let it get too ripe. So that's how the stem would come off normally if it was allowed to drop. It'd just drop with the stem. But if it's too ripe, it'll drop without the stem. Neither one of those are bad. It's when the stem is pulled out prematurely that causes it to introduce moisture. Castlebright, Ambricot, there's a number. Wesley's, they're all a little more susceptible to the stem coming out. older varieties. And the ones over here that we were walked by earlier, I had finished picking. They're the earlier varieties, the poppy and the Katy, and they're more or less planted in the chronological order that we would pick them. So these first trees would be poppies, and there's still some on the trees, but they would have been about 4 weeks ago. Generally, the way I approach it is I plant a few more of earlier or later fruit trees because they don't always produce as much, or they're random production between 1 to 3 years, 4 years sometimes. They'll have 1 good year and 2 mediocre and 1 bad, or 1 poor year. And if you plant a few more trees, it equals what a mid-season apricot would be producing with half the trees. So interspersed in here is a relatively new variety called a robata, and you've heard of those, and you've seen them in different places. They looking like they're almost ripe, but they're firm. If you get an even amount of fruit on a tree, you'll get pretty much medium or equal size. If you have a lot on a tree, they're going to be smaller size. And you don't thin apricots or plums where you thin peaches and different types of other fruit. As a result, it's going to produce what the tree is able to manage without it being overloaded. A sparseness on the tree, then you would have, in general, larger fruit. That's as a result of what the tree is able to manage. These middle ones in here, which I've been picking, are Moorpark. And Moorparks have a little greenness to them, and some people are put off by that, but they don't know that the Moorpark is really a pretty good apricot. These are a combination of Moor Castlebright, and these are Moorparks. Moorparks, you don't have to worry too much about the stem. They come off with a nice break, and they're below the flesh line, which makes it cleaner to look at too. But see, they have a little bit of green at the seam, and that tends to put off people, but they're really usually a nice orange inside, and that's where the flavor is. And the Moorpark is pretty consistent with this, whatever the tree's able to manage. In other words, if it's a heavy crop, they're smaller like they were this year, but in general, they're a nice medium-sized apricot. After this midsection of apricots, we'll get into the Patterson, which are the next trees down here, and then some more robata. One thing that you should be aware of is the combinations that result in the pluots and the apriums and the plumcots. They've become really popular for their flavors and intensities and colors and everything, but that is a result of, in all cases, an apricot and a plum. And it's an interspecific combination. So that means that it's not exactly the same combination of plum and apricot in all cases.
What Tony is talking about here are hybrid fruits. Since plums and apricots are closely related, it is possible for an apricot tree to naturally cross-pollinate with a plum tree that is nearby. When 2 different types of trees cross-pollinate, resulting fruit won't be another apricot or another plum. Instead, it will carry on certain characteristics of each of the parent plants, creating an entirely new type of fruit. These apricot-plum hybrids have become very popular in recent decades, and there are plenty growing around California orchards like Inzana.
So you have an aprium, greater percentage apricot, pluot, greater percentage plum, and plumcot, which is 50-50. These trees are also about 30 years old, but the way that they grew them initially, pluots, was to make sure that there was part of the tree that was the plum and part of it was the pluot that resulted from it, and then you had to plant the pollinator also around. But so when these trees will bloom, you'll have a Santa Rosa plum that's right next to a Flavor King pluot. And the Flavor King benefits from the Santa Rosa plum in addition to the Ambricot Apricot. So you needed both of them initially, and so they helped you out by putting part of them on the tree with it, and you had a tree that produced both. That was only with the first plantings, and that's what these trees are. So when they ripen, you'll have Santa Rosa plums on one half and Flavor King pluots on the other half. How they approached it, because they didn't know that there would be enough pollination to get the results that they wanted. The requirement is to have a pollinator that has a overlapping season with the cultivar. The pollinator is the fruit that basically plants the seed to be cultivated by the cultivar, and in that particular relationship, you need them within a certain distance of each other. And a great pollinator is the Ambricot. The Ambricot Apricot has a long season, and it spans from the beginning of the first apricots to pretty much the late middle of apricots, and it provides a lot of pollination for a lot of pluots. The plum that provides that is an early queen, and it has that long span. In order to have that pollination take place, they need to be within a certain proximity of each other. So in different places in the orchard, I will have one early queen plum. In a different other place, I'll have one Ambricot. And it's usually in a place that is in a row of apricots or in a row of plums in order to accomplish the pollination of pluots and plumcots. You'll notice that in some areas where I have a single tree of one particular fruit, and that's the reason for it.
Growing fruit in an orchard requires planning, patience, and a whole lot of work. Unlike vegetables that may have a season of just a few months, Inzana Ranch has some trees that have been producing fruit for 30 years. That kind of time frame requires lots of planning to think about the effects that certain changes might have on not just one individual crop, but on the entire orchard.
One thing we started out with, and you can see the tops of them over there, is an Australian variety of willow tree that basically common name is an Austree. And that is an early blooming deciduous tree that the bees love. So the bees, being bees, going to be attracted by any tree that is flowering early, because there's not going to be a lot of varieties of things that are going to flower as early as almonds, which is in the first part of February. They need something to attract bees from a natural standpoint, as opposed to having bees trucked in and placed in orchards. So every one of these rows down here, and then over there where those trees are, there was a whole row of them there. There was a whole row of them in the back. I planted those all over the place to entice early bees to visit here and be able to pollinate almonds, so I wouldn't have to rent bees. And it wasn't for the money so much as to establish the microclimate, which wouldn't need bees in the future, and so we don't have any bees and don't need bees because we have plenty of our own. If you plant California pepper trees for their canopy and for their shade, they're early blooming, they attract a lot of bees. Os trees do the same thing. Eucalyptus does the same thing. The first tree in every one of these rows is an early queen plum. specifically for the pollination of the trees in succession down the row. This is the Ambricot that I said benefited the pollination. And here you have an example of the balance of these trees being plumcots, pluots, or apriums, all because of the pollinators that are placed here to make the fruit. So these were all Pattersons that you're walking under now. Some more, these are robatas on this side. These are fairly young trees. They're a pretty aggressive tree. They tend to drop though, so you have to kind of be paying attention to them. You know, it takes usually 2 years to set fruit. So potentially you could have it on the second year. But if you prune a tree like this, the initial growth in the first year from where you pruned will not produce any fruit. It will be the second year that you'll get the fruit production. These are apriums here. You can see them on the ground, honey-rich apriums. And this is another row of apricots. You can tell by the fullness and roundness of a leaf. That usually is an indicator of apricots, as opposed to the long, skinny leaves of plums, other fruit. This first tree here is an early queen plum for the same reason. It provides that pollination for the apricots to make the crosses.
One of the reasons why apricots have been so popular across the world is because they are easily preserved. Dried apricots were important in the Persian Empire over 2,000 years ago, and canned apricots were a staple in American households through the mid-1900s. But as transportation and storage improved, farmers began thinking about how to produce apricots that were hardy enough to stand up to the fresh fruit at the market.
Frames that hold drying trays, and they're just old, old school type things. We send raisins to be dried, or grapes to be dried, apples to be dried, and persimmons to be dried, dehydrated, because well, we have one raisin variety that we do dry in the sun, the red flame, but for the most part, you get too late in the year. See, it takes 7 to 10 days sometimes in the sun, even in August, depending on the fruit. So if you extend that into September, October, you might not get those Sundays or those hours.
Apricots have a sweet, tart flavor, similar to other stone fruits like peaches and plums. They are packed with vitamins and antioxidants that benefit our eyes, skin, and gut health. Whether you prefer to eat them dried, canned, or fresh off the tree, apricots make for a healthy and delicious summertime snack. What a fun day! We hope you enjoyed our visit to Inzana Ranch. We'll see you next time on Beyond the Market.